everyone. Thank you for joining us today for a conversation about the dangers of cyber abuse and the other risks kids face online. And we're also going to be talking about the changes we need to see to ensure our children are shielded from these harms. But before we begin, I want to make sure you know that this is a conversation for adults that will cover some heavy and pretty upsetting topics. So please take care as you listen. This is an important and really timely conversation. Last month, I and other leaders of the Mama movement received a powerful reminder of how the tragic and preventable harms of poorly designed tech products have devastated so many American families. In Washington, D.C., more than a dozen of our chapter leaders from across the country gathered on June 23rd to mark Social Media Victims Remembrance Day, a day to honor the children who have been lost to addictive and dangerous social media and AI products or online exploitation. We stood with the parents of dozens of the 272 children who were represented at a Capitol Hill memorial, 31 more children than last year. These survivor parents offered beautiful stories of their children, spoke powerfully about how addictive, exploitative technology devastated their families, and called for policies that ensure we don't lose even one more child to unsafe algorithm design. The next day, our Mama contingent traveled to Capitol Hill to take up the survivor parents' call to action, demanding that lawmakers support comprehensive legislation that protects children from the harms of addictive social media, without provisions that serve the interest of big tech at a cost to families. We visited the offices of all 100 senators, urging them to support the Kids Online Safety Act, or KOSA, which the Senate previously passed in an overwhelmingly bipartisan fashion, and to oppose efforts to amend KOSA with a provision that would block or preempt all state AI safety laws. Our message was simple. Nothing matters more than our children's safety, and we need policies that put kids over big tech profits. I came away from the week truly in awe of the passion and commitment of our mamas to ensure that real life experiences remain at the heart of healthy childhoods. That dedication to preserving the magic of childhood also inspired our brand new Protect Imagination campaign, which has drawn hundreds of new parents into our movement with a call to help us protect kids from big tech. To further explore the dangers that addictive, exploitative tech pose to our kids, we're honored today to be joined by Lindsay Lieberman. Lindsay is the founder and managing attorney of Lindsay Lieberman LLC, a law and consulting firm dedicated to combating cyber abuse, sexual exploitation, and gender-based violence. She also works with schools, parent groups, law enforcement agencies, judges, and community organizations to educate the public about emerging forms of online harm and strategies for prevention. Lindsay also serves as an adjunct professor at Salve ReginaUniversity and is a frequent speaker on cyber abuse, trauma-informed advocacy, children's online safety, and technology-facilitated violence. Before founding her firm, Lindsay worked as a senior attorney at a leading sexual privacy law firm and served as a sex crimes prosecutor in Brooklyn, New York. Lindsay has been featured in many, many credible media outlets from the Washington Post to CNN and is the co-author of the American Bar Association's criminal justice publication, Cyber Sexual Misconduct: The Evolution of Sexual Privacy Laws and Best Practices for Representing Victims. Lindsay, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Julie.
We are so glad you're here. And I know you've said in the past that watching Law and Order SVU as a teenager made you want to become a sex crimes prosecutor. And you actually did it. What was the gap between the TV version of that work and what you actually encountered when you got to the Brooklyn DA's office?
Well, yes, it is true that I was inspired and wanted to be prosecutor Alexandra Cabot. And I did, I worked really hard and I got that opportunity. I'd say the biggest difference was that in Law and Order, they always seem to be working on only one case at a time. And I just remember my desk at the prosecutor's office being covered in um, piles and piles of different case files. But other than that, it was quite similar. I prosecuted cases of child sex abuse and sexual violence, and I saw firsthand how the justice system works and also how sometimes it doesn't work for survivors of these kinds of crimes.
So eventually you left prosecution and you built a private practice representing victims of sexual violence and cyber abuse. What led you to start your own firm?
As a prosecutor, you don't represent the victim, you represent the state. And I oftentimes felt like I wanted to be the advocate for the survivor, and I had to keep them at arm's length. And so a switch to civil law made sense so that I could start really advocating for my clients directly. And at the same time, the area of revenge porn or intimate image abuse started making headlines, and laws started to get introduced to criminalize such online behavior. So there were only a few attorneys in the space. I saw a need for advocacy, and with my background and expertise, it just made sense. So I have my own law firm now, and I represent survivors of sexual privacy violations, both offline and also online. And sadly, that includes children and teenagers. I also work in prevention, as you mentioned, educating parents, teachers, and community leaders about the importance of educating our children about the risks and harms online, but also, most importantly, making it very clear that if something happens, there are safe adults who can help.
So I want to give you a chance to talk about how kids and young people get entrapped in these kinds of harms. But before we do that, let's take a step back and look at the landscape that parents and kids are dealing with today. What are the biggest online risks facing children that parents may not fully understand? And where do you see the most dangerous gaps between what parents think is happening and what's actually happening?
The two biggest risks, or the two categories that I think about, the first is that adults, perpetrators, they target our children to commit crimes against them. Mostly they are sexual crimes in nature, and this is sextortion or exposure to pornography. And the second risk is that children are harming each other online in these same ways and in other ways, like cyberbullying. uh, Parents trying to grapple with the idea that their children could be on either side of that equation, either the victim or the perpetrator, and that's hard for them to think about. I had a case where a bunch of 12-year-old boys were creating these really cruel TikTok videos about one of their classmates who was already vulnerable. And the theme of the TikToks were for each child to really express just how much they hated this one child. It was heartbreaking. The parents of the offenders, they all argued, oh, kids will be kids. This is just kids. They're exploring and they're learning. Whereas the parents of the child who was the victim, they saw it as a life-altering experience that could lead to tragic outcomes. So it's really complicated and it's really serious. In terms of the gaps that you're asking about, unfortunately, many parents that I speak to think that these kinds of things that happen online will never happen to their kids or their families. They're the kinds of things that happen to other people's kids. And of course, we know that that's not true. And another gap is that parents will always come to me and ask me, what's that one perfect parental control? Or what's that one safe app that I can install on my kids' devices that will solve all of my problems?
Mama
And
gets asked this all the time. What's the one thing? And it's so challenging because we want to provide resources, and also it's hard to tell parents because there is no one thing that will keep them safe.
there is no one thing. These apps and devices are just not safe, and that's by design, as we know.
So girls and boys are both vulnerable, but sometimes it's in different ways. We had a recent guest on our Expert Insight series, Karen Alamo, and she shared a lot about the challenges girls face in particular, but boys also deal with unique kinds of challenges. Can you talk to us a little bit about sextortion, what it is, how it happens, and why it moves so fast that families often have no time to intervene?
Yes, sextortion is becoming one of the most urgent threats that are facing children, particularly boys. Typically, somebody, a perpetrator, will pose as another teenager and convinces a child, a teen, to become intimate, to send maybe an intimate photo. Within minutes, as soon as the bad actor has some image or video, everything changes. And then, of course, the threats start. And the child is threatened that if they don't pay or provide even more graphic or harmful sexual content, that the pictures and videos will be distributed to their parents, their teachers, their school, their friends. For a teenager to think that their entire world might see them nude is basically to think that their lives are over, sadly. The demands escalate really fast. And, we know that these sextortion scams aren't happening because the teenager was irresponsible or reckless or because the parents did anything wrong. It is nobody's fault but the perpetrator, who is an adult and is intentionally using this technology that doesn't protect kids to manipulate them and commit these crimes. We've we've seen tragic cases where teenagers have taken their own lives after being victims of sextortion. It often happens within hours. The FBI is reporting that at least 38 children in the US have taken their own lives between 2021 and 2025. 50,000 reports of sextortion involving children were made to NCMEC in 2025.
And can
And
we define NCMEC for everybody? That's the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and they are the ones who sort of keep a clearinghouse of these reports.
exactly. And this just shouldn't be happening. There's no reason for this. And a big piece of this also, which I think is important to share with parents, is well-intentioned parents will often warn their children repeatedly, never take a picture of yourself, never share a naked picture. Under no circumstances. They are so afraid, rightfully so, for their children's welfare and what might happen that they're very strict on these rules. But unfortunately, we're seeing that fear tactic adds to that distress that the child feels when the sextortion happens. And then they believe there's no hope. And so we really want to make sure parents explain to their kids that there is hope, that even if something terrible has happened, there are adults that can help us through
And
this.
they can always come to us. Absolutely always.
Exactly.
It's also important to take a moment to discuss intimate image abuse, what is sometimes called revenge porn. Many adults think that that's something that happens only to adults or to teenagers who are already dating. You've argued that we need to be talking about it much earlier. What is intimate image abuse, and why should parents be having this conversation long before children start dating?
Intimate image abuse is any form of abusing another person using intimate images. Often we're seeing somebody might capture another person without their knowledge or consent using a camera, or receive a picture with consent. I say consent, but actually children can't consent to creating these kinds of pictures. And then the other person distributing or showing other people those pictures. Well, yes, it is commonly referred to as revenge porn. We really try and stay away from that term because it usually has nothing to do with revenge. Revenge suggests that the person who's victimized did something to deserve it, and that is almost never the case. The conduct, sharing somebody else's intimate image without consent, it is criminal now in all 50 states and in the federal legal system. But somehow, Julie, all over our country, in every state, in every school, kids are doing this to each other. I had a case where two teenagers were in an intimate relationship with one another, and they thought they were exchanging this, private, intimate moment on FaceTime. And one of them was actually recording it with another device, and it wound up getting out to classmates. It's a form of domestic violence when it is an intimate partner situation, and it's extremely serious. But like you said, it doesn't only happen in intimate contexts, because I also see kids daring each other to perform sex acts all the time on video calls and to share nude images. we're seeing kids doing it to each other as practical jokes. So it's got
You
to be
know,
spoken about to all kids.
yeah, and I mean, part of what's so challenging is that part of the definition of being an adolescent is rule testing, rule breaking. And when we hand them a technology that wasn't designed for them, it wasn't designed with their safety in mind, we're putting them in a position where we know they're going to try to test boundaries. I think that's also the case with these notification apps that have been proliferating. Last year, you presented at the DC Bar Judicial and Bar Conference on deep fakes and AI generated exploitation. What new dangers does generative AI create for children and teens? And how is that different from the harms you were seeing 5 years ago?
Right. It used to be that unless you captured a naked picture of yourself, you couldn't be the victim of intimate image abuse. And so we had this like strange sense of like safety as long as we made smart decisions. Of course, it's never the victim's fault if their images are shared without their consent. But nowadays, with artificial intelligence, the technology exists to create a nude image or a nude video or a pornographic video of anybody. So we are all in danger. And the technology is sophisticated and it's convincing. And we are seeing this happening in schools all across the country where teenagers are using these nudify apps to create images and videos of their classmates. And the harm is really serious, both for the victims but also the perpetrators, because these teenagers are getting arrested. There was a big case in Westfield, New Jersey, a few years ago that was in the news, and more arrests are happening now. And, I'm a victims' rights attorney, and I do believe in accountability, but I'm extremely concerned that the answer in these situations is to arrest teenagers for, like you said, testing boundaries and taking risks when we're literally giving them this technology and we are not making it safe. And when I say we, I don't mean parents, I mean society, I mean tech companies, I mean schools, all of us together in this.
And parents, as a parent, I gave my kids this technology and without fully appreciating all of the risks that were involved. And unfortunately, over the last 2 decades, we have learned the hard way what some of the risks are. When you read Instagram's response to reporting on dozens of children who died by suicide after sextortion, and they claimed that its platform was still studying the problem, you wrote a LinkedIn article about your reaction. What should parents know about where the major platforms currently stand on protecting children? And what do you want the platforms to actually do?
They're not doing enough. They have excellent marketing teams and they make it seem like they are just on top of the issue. I don't even have a teenager, but I get marketed these like safe meta teen accounts. It's an effort to convince us that we can stop thinking about it, that we don't have to worry because we parents are exhausted and busy. And it's like one less thing to worry about, but it's not real. And the New York Times just recently released a report that they did a whole investigation and the child safety features for Instagram and Snapchat, they don't work. Our kids are able to figure out ways around it, and they're still accessing inappropriate or unlawful content, and they're still being targeted by perpetrators. The tech companies have to do better, and they probably will not do better until the government makes them.
And, that is something, unfortunately, we have learned time and time again that when these companies have had opportunities internally, their own staff have, told their bosses, we have to fix this problem. And the bosses declined to do that. Thanks to some very brave whistleblowers, we now have lots of evidence that they know how the design choices they made are contributing directly to these harms. So I agree with you. I don't think these companies will change until our lawmakers require them to make the product safe by design, just like we have done with automobiles, with cigarettes, all of these other things. You also have said in your writings that kids are always going to out tech us, that we can never build systems airtight enough that children won't find their way around them. What do you mean by that? And what does that mean for how we think about protection?
Right. Despite parental controls and safety guardrails, kids are always going to be, the next generation, they're always going to be able to think about tech differently and in a more advanced way and probably get past whatever guardrails we set up. Even if our parental guardrails work for our particular kids and their devices, they're still going to get access on their friends' devices, on the school bus. So again, it's important that parents don't think that there's some magic setting or magic device that's going to just protect our kids and that'll be fine. And this is why when I speak with parents, I always emphasize the importance of connection over control. It means conversations, education, prevention. It means having open discussions about the risks and harms online, instead of kind of ignoring them and keeping our heads in the sand and hoping that it doesn't happen to our kids. I encourage parents to talk to their kids about how we make good decisions, about how to analyze a situation to determine if it's safe and what steps your child should take. And of course, most importantly, that if anything happens, you come to your parent or to a safe adult that you have in your life. I'll share that I have a little 6-year-old, and she came to me a few weeks ago, and she was so hesitant and quiet and careful, and she whispered in my ear that she had colored on the wall. She had realized she did something wrong, but she felt this instinct to do it. And I gave her a big hug and I kissed her and I thanked her for telling me. And I know that sounds silly, but each opportunity that you have to love your child and support their decision to come to you instead of a friend or AI or anybody else is an opportunity to tell them that you are their safe person and they should come to you no matter what.
I'm so glad you mentioned that because we have seen research recently that children, unfortunately, are turning to AI chatbots for help with homework before turning to parents or peers or teachers. And it's really unfortunate because we know these chatbots, in many cases, in many places, are not regulated, and also that they are designed in such a way that they are actually encouraging children to conduct themselves in ways that are unsafe or commit harmful acts to themselves or others, whether that's eating disorders, self-harming, or even, God forbid, suicide. And we have seen, too many cases already of children and adults who were encouraged to end their own lives by chatbots. So, you just talked about the parents, that the kind of conversation that parents should be having with their kids. And you said you deliberately avoid telling parents what their kids should not do. Why do you say that, and what should they be saying instead?
Well, we say not necessarily to tell the kids all of the things that they shouldn't do exactly for the reason that we mentioned earlier, in terms of we know what kids want to do. They want to rebel, they want to test limits and boundaries. So, what we really need to do instead of giving them a laundry list of don'ts is teach them the skills that they need to handle those situations where maybe an AI chatbot is giving them dangerous information that could cause harm. So, one way to do this is to really, in those discussions that you have with your kids, ask hard, open ended questions to get them thinking about how they might respond. For example, you could ask, how do you recognize pressure? Like what do you feel in your body when you feel pressured to do something? And what kinds of things would someone do or say that might make you feel pressured? How would you respond? How do you respond when you feel pressure? Other questions like, what does healthy friendship look like? And you need to, of course, start these conversations as early as possible, because I'm sure a 16-year-old is going to be like, what are you talking about? If you just start then. Not to say it's ever too late. There, you can always start these conversations, but maybe using different terms or, maybe being cooler about your language.
And
Um,
an age appropriate language, right? I mean, we love Lisa Damour and, Dr. Becky, who are really good at sort of helping provide scripts for managing these conversations and starting early and often, not to scare them, but to give them the tools to understand how to think about these things and also recognize that when you type into AI and it gives you an answer, we know that at least 20% of the time the answers are just completely wrong. So how do you kind of recognize that these tools exist, but they're not exactly as reliable as, say, a calculator?
Exactly. And, to that point, because so many of my cases involve intimate images of children, and that kind of boils down to consent, we can start teaching our kids about consent as soon as they're toddlers. One thing that I do that might be helpful for other parents is I have little ones, and of course, I want to capture their photos. They're so cute. But before I do, I always say, can I take a picture of you? Can I take a video of you? And it seems so simple, but the idea I'm sending to them, hopefully, is oh, I get to control who captures my image. I control my body, and I get to say who can have access to the picture of me and who doesn't. So, starting really early with those kinds of messages and conversations can be really helpful for later on.
So I have a harder question now. What can parents do if something goes wrong? So when a child comes to them or when a parent discovers something themselves, what are the immediate steps parents should take? And what mistakes do parents commonly make in those first hours and days? And what are some things that they can keep in mind in case something happens?
The most important thing for a parent to do is to pause. Because when something like sextortion happens or there's a nude image of your kid, your immediate response is going to be the same as theirs, which is hypervigilance, fight or flight. The decision making parts of our brains go offline, and so you need to pause and take some deep breaths and know that there is help out there, just like we want your kids to know. We typically want you to screenshot everything. So basically, preserving all of the evidence of whatever the crime or offense was, so that later you have options to report to law enforcement or take legal action if you decide that you want to and it's appropriate. Um, you often should and can report to the platform, even though we know that that doesn't necessarily solve the problem. It's worth doing. And then again, consider, depending on how severe it was or what happened, the details, reporting to law enforcement, contacting an attorney. We can help with crisis management. We can help inform you of your rights and your legal options. And there's also organizations like Mama out there. So, knowing about these things beforehand can really help parents respond appropriately when these things happen.
I have personally helped a few parents through crisis situations while their child has been sextorted or they have discovered the exchange of sexual images between adults who are not in the same community. You have walked families into police precincts before and seen how law enforcement responds or doesn't respond. What legal protections exist for children who are victims of cyber abuse, and where are the most significant gaps? Like, can you say a little about what families should realistically expect when they involve law enforcement?
Yes. So if your child has been the victim of sextortion, I always recommend reporting to law enforcement. The reason being that we need our law enforcement officers to know and understand how common this is happening and how often, so that they can put the right resources and time into prevention and education and response. But I say that with the caveat that the person who committed this crime and sextorted your child is probably not going to face justice. They are probably some random troll in a basement in another country, and they're not going to be caught. And that can be really hard. And yet, still, it's important to report. Then, when I have cases of child sex abuse and it's between teenagers, it's two kids that have hurt each other, it's also complicated, and there aren't clear-cut, easy answers. Oftentimes, law enforcement questions whether the right thing to do is to arrest a teenager for a crime when let's say the
Did you?
victim thinks that they've consented or that it was like a consensual relationship, whereas we know it's actually child sex abuse material. Or again, in terms of like the consequences for a teenager to be arrested. So there are laws on the book and there are legal rights, and yet these cases are very rarely straightforward. And that's something that parents have to deal with, and something that maybe we could get better at navigating.
I think another reality is that right now our FBI is completely overwhelmed by the number of sextortion reports. If you go to their website, it's very difficult to even um, count on being able to reach a live FBI agent. They want you to report it. There are mechanisms now for you to report it, but there are so many cases that unfortunately there are parents who are not getting the support they need from law enforcement. And so that's why, we're happy to connect people with resources, share the skills and the tools that we have on how you can respond in a situation like that. And, I agree that it's really complex because when we're talking about juveniles committing the crime, we know that they aren't adult predators. They don't have a fully formed brain, and that we need to ensure that we protect children while also helping perpetrators recognize why their actions were wrong and learn how to be responsible and not have that kind of conduct in the future. Can you just touch on what the double blind legal trap is? What is that?
Well, I believe it's referring to the problem that often comes up when we go to law enforcement, which is that if a victim's intimate images have been disseminated by another person, the victim herself or himself has actually also committed a crime by capturing child sex abuse material, capturing the intimate image of themselves, and
A
they are
minor.
a minor. Exactly. So a lot of parents are afraid, like, well, can we go to the police because our child technically also committed a crime? Again, another situation where it's so complicated, and there's no easy answers and has devastating outcomes. So again, like, most importantly is, yes, accountability, but it's the prevention, it's the education. It's so often when these things happen, like, everybody's looking to other entities to be responsible. The parents are looking to the school. The school looks to law enforcement. Law enforcement looks to the school. Everybody's pointing to the tech companies. They're blaming the parents, but nobody is actually solving this problem for our kids. And I argue that it's all of us as a society. We all need to step up and do better and end this. This is a crisis.
I couldn't agree with you more. And also, I do think that we have to have regulations in place the same way we have seen, if nobody hands a dangerous product like a car to a 12-year-old, yeah, here's the keys and say, just be responsible. I'm going to educate you how to be responsible. Or same with alcohol or cigarettes. We know these products are dangerous. So we've made the decision as a society, we're not going to let you touch them until you're 18. Of course, I'll admit here, I did a little teen drinking. So having a ban doesn't fully prevent it, but it makes it a lot harder. It sets certain societal norms. And I think the more we get these regulations that have passed into place, the more improvement we're going to see, which actually is a great segue right into the question of schools. As both a victim's rights attorney and a parent advocate, you really have a distinctive vantage point on the increasing use of technology in schools. What concerns you most about this movement and the proliferation of tech products and AI in the classroom?
Oh, well, with my background in 15 years of helping survivors of cyber sexual abuse, I can tell you that I was shocked to learn that my 5-year-old was given a tablet within the first week of kindergarten. I was horrified, just knowing not only how much harm can be done and suffered from the device, but also knowing about the lack of accountability and responsibility from the companies who are putting these devices into our children's hands. Uh, so I am quite concerned, but more importantly, after expressing my concern and talking to a couple of other parents in my community, we started looking into the research to see, like, well, does it make sense to be giving kids these products and devices? Do they need them in order to learn in school these days? And the answer is no. There has been no objective evidence that shows that any of these devices, the ed tech platforms that schools are giving to our kids are actually helping them learn. And if anything, this evidence is showing that it's doing the opposite.
It really is shocking when you look at the research and over again, different people are looking at it with the same result. It's not even controversial. Nobody can find any evidence that these products are improving educational outcomes. Many writers have and parents have shared examples of school issued devices being used to access deeply inappropriate content, everything from pornography to gambling to, violence. How common is that, do you think, in your experience? And what does it tell us about the gap between what schools think is happening on the devices and what is actually happening?
It's everywhere. It's rampant. I'm extremely involved with my local Washington, D.C. Parent group that is working towards getting regulations on device use in schools. And so I've talked to hundreds and hundreds of parents. They all have a story. One parent's 8-year-old is playing zombie video games with like bloody zombies running around on the screen. Another young child was playing this game where you have to make these like life decisions as if you're an adult. And one of the questions that you have to decide is whether or not you want to wear a condom when you have sexual relations. Even a close friend of mine got access to her daughter's device and did a Google search on the device, how to commit suicide, and all the answers came up. And there was no flag from the school, there was no flag from the district. So, in terms of those gaps, if the schools don't know about it, they're not doing their jobs, or maybe they don't know how to do their jobs. And if they, in that capacity, and if they do know about it, they don't know how to stop it. And they don't know how to stop it because, of course, the companies aren't helping them. They aren't providing these platforms with those limitations and restrictions already built in.
And companies have told schools that the products are safe. So the schools have trusted sometimes third parties to say, this has a filter on it, this has a block on it. But I hear stories all the time. I mean, the new thing that's happening is that children are using VPNs to get around the school filters. So I had a parent come to me recently because her child was using the school laptop to communicate, and share inappropriate and dangerous sexual abuse images online after being groomed by strangers. So, this is happening on a school device. I have seen cases where a child used a school device to learn how to kill themselves. And, people, I think, aren't aware of how great the risks are sometimes until it's too late. And again, that was a motivation in starting Mama and making sure more people are aware of what's actually happening. You encountered this, of course, in your daughter's kindergarten class, as you wrote in the Washington Post. So when you enrolled your daughter in kindergarten, you had a vision of what the classroom would look like, and what you found was pretty different. What did you find, and what did you do about it?
I just, within the first few weeks, I was handed, it was the first week, I was handed a QR code. And apparently on this QR code was like all of these accounts that had been set up for my 5-year-old, all of this data that was being sent of hers to these tech companies with no answers. I had all these questions, like what are these platforms and where is the data being sent and what data and what privacy, protocols are in place, and there were no answers. Then within the first few weeks of school, my daughter came home singing and dancing to K-pop Demon Hunters, which is a fabulous movie, but for families who decided not to let their children watch movies with potential adult themes, it was pretty jarring, and I found it pretty inappropriate. So I started doing that research and talking to other families. I published this piece in the Washington Post, and the response was huge. Hundreds and hundreds of parents now are taking steps towards getting safe, research-based education into our children's schools instead of allowing for screens to replace teachers and to control the curriculum.
So at Mama, our chapter leaders and members come with sort of a wide range of fluency on these issues. For parents who are just becoming aware of the challenges of what we call ed tech, or what is called education technology, and I put that in quotes because, again, it hasn't been shown to actually improve educational outcomes. What is the single most important first step they should take at their child's school?
Yes, and I like that you put ed tech in quotes because in Washington, D.C., we talk about the difference between tech ed, like learning about technology is great. Should our kids learn about AI? Yes. But being on screens, swiping on gamified TV episodes, that's not education. So, in terms of what parents should do if they're just getting started, ask questions. Ask your kids when they come home from school, ask the teachers what the class is doing and what screen time looks like. Start talking to other parents in the community. I bet other parents are also asking questions and starting to get, curious. You can always plug into one of the many organizations like Mama and Schools Beyond Screens and the Distraction Free School Policy Project to plug in with other advocates who are leading the way um, to to make school better for our children. They need time outside. Our kids need human interaction. They need critical thinking skills, and they need less time swiping on screens.
We have resources on our website at wearemama.org. If you click on Learn, that parents can print out and use to have those conversations. One of them is called 8 Questions to Ask About AI in Schools. And one of the things that even school administrators are only now beginning to think about is the potential liability of introducing this product to the classroom, where we've had, insurance companies recently inform all the social media platforms that they're not going to defend them in the lawsuits because the harms to children were by design and they had knowledge about the harms to children. So, we have those resources there. And I think you're exactly right that just starting by asking questions about where your child's data is being captured, how is it being used, what are the purposes of these different apps, and how much. One question we encourage everybody to ask is, how much time is my child being required to be on a screen every day at school? All over the world, we have seen what eye specialists call a myopia crisis, because so many children are becoming nearsighted after spending a ridiculous number of hours on screens and not having their eyes be allowed to have the normal, healthy human experience of adjusting to different sights. In Taiwan, I believe they passed a requirement that every school-age child had to go outside and play for 2 hours a day. And within 1 year, they were able to end the rise they had seen in myopia. So the solutions are not expensive and they're not hard, but it's really, unfortunately, a responsibility of parents to stand up and give voice to children's needs, because the corporate pressures and the demands to, be ready for an AI future, or those kinds of, hollow expressions have overridden logic in a lot of places. Lindsay, you work at what feels like two ends of the same problem: the harm children experience when they encounter predators and abuse online, and the systems that give children unrestricted internet access in the first place, including schools. How do you think about the relationship between those two things? Is the school screen issue at its core a child safety issue?
Yes, 100%. The schools in screens is a child safety issue, as well as an educational issue, as well as a health issue, like you just explained. Um, you know, it's not just schools and it's not just parents. I think that we as a society, we all need to step up better and in more significant ways. I like to, when I speak with parents, encourage conversations with law enforcement to come into the schools and educate kids on what they're seeing, why they can't take action, what the consequences are. I like to encourage synagogues and churches to bring in speakers and start having these conversations about safety online, because our kids need to hear it from everybody and we all need to be invested in it. Like you said, if insurance companies aren't covering it And the schools, are the schools liable? We'll see. Nobody is taking responsibility for our kids. So everybody, elected officials, tech companies, police, community leaders, we all have to do better, have these conversations, provide these trainings and resources, and give our kids the childhoods that they deserve.
If you could change one thing systemically, one structural shift that would have the greatest impact on child safety online, what would it be?
It all comes back to the tech companies. It's Silicon Valley, and we've discussed it already at length, but keeping kids safe online, it doesn't help their profit. It's not profitable for them. And so they've been resisting and resisting, and they'll continue to resist, even though they are now starting to lose some lawsuits against them. But there's big money in what they do and how they've convinced us that we must rely on them for our everyday lives. And until they make those changes, whether it's because the government forces them and regulates them, which I hope happens, or otherwise, we're not going to see our kids safe online.
If there's one thing you want every parent in this audience to do before they go to sleep tonight, and not just parents, but caregivers, grandparents, one concrete action, what would that be?
It always goes back to connection over control. So instead of listing all the don'ts, tell your kids, tell your grandkids, tell your nephews and nieces that if anything ever happens and you're afraid and you think you've made a terrible mistake, come to me. We will handle it together.
Lindsay, you've built a career seeing the worst of what the internet does to children and families. You've also become the mother of two daughters who will grow up in this world. My final question is one that's about the future. Despite all of the darkness you've seen your clients endure, what really gives you hope?
What gives me hope is getting to talk to parents and communities and getting opportunities like being on this podcast and all the work that you're doing at Mama and all the advocacy we're seeing, not just in Washington, D.C., where I live, but across the country to get regulations at the very least in our schools to protect our children. And my daughters give me hope. And my clients give me hope, and their parents in their bravery and their decisions to speak out and take action. And my clients inspire me every day.
I know today's conversation has touched on some tough subjects, but it's crucial that parents and caregivers know what dangers and risks kids are facing online. And God forbid anything happens, to know what their options are. Lindsay, you've given us so much to think about. Thank you so much for your time, your expertise, and most importantly, for the work that you're doing on behalf of families affected by these kinds of harms. Friends, we will include all of the links we referred to in today's conversation with Lindsay in the notes, including her important and also kind of fun to read piece in the Washington Post. Lindsay, thank you again. And thank you to everyone who tuned in to join us. And keep an eye out for our next Expert Insight series, which is dropping soon. Bye-bye.